David and Ruth Reynolds seemed like an ordinary mother and son living quietly in their suburban home, until a horrifying discovery shattered that peaceful image forever. What happened behind closed doors would reveal a chilling story of betrayal, cruelty, and a darkness no one saw coming. In a peaceful suburb where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and families waved hello to neighbors, the Reynolds family lived quietly in their modest home. David Reynolds was known to the community as a polite, if somewhat reserved man in his late 30s. He rarely socialized but was always seen tending to his mother's garden or collecting her mail when she was out. Ruth Reynolds, his elderly mother, was a sweet woman with a gentle smile and a fondness for baking pies. To outsiders, their relationship seemed ordinary, even caring, but beneath the calm surface, there were cracks that no one in the neighborhood could see. Ruth rarely left the house alone and often looked tired, her cheerful smile fading when David was around. Neighbors noticed that over the years, Ruth seemed to grow more withdrawn, avoiding conversations and spending more time indoors. David, too, became increasingly isolated, his visits to the local grocery store or hardware store growing less frequent. The once quiet home had grown colder. On a particularly hot summer day, Ruth was seen by a few neighbors stepping out briefly, waving softly before closing the door behind her. She was wearing her favorite floral dress, the one she wore for gardening, and carrying a small basket. But that day, she never returned. Hours slipped by with no sign of her. David didn't answer the phone when family members called to check on his mother's well-being. Friends who stopped by were met with silence. Something felt off. The usual sounds of life inside the Reynolds house, the creak of floorboards, the occasional laughter or humming from Ruth, had vanished. Neighbors began whispering among themselves, their worry growing. Agnes Carter, an elderly woman living across the street, was the first to mention a strange smell wafting from the Reynolds home. It was a sharp, acrid odor unlike anything she had ever smelled before. At first, she thought it was something, burning or a forgotten pot on the stove, but the smell lingered and grew stronger. Days passed, and concern turned into alarm. The local community reached out to the police, urging them to check on Ruth's welfare. When officers arrived, they found the front door unlocked, the house eerily silent except for the thick steam filling the kitchen. What they discovered inside would soon shock everyone and tear the neighborhood apart. But at that moment, none of the neighbors or police could have imagined the dark reality behind the closed doors of the Reynolds home. David was missing. The man who should have been caring for his mother had vanished, leaving behind a mystery that was just beginning to unravel. The seemingly quiet life of the Reynolds family was about to reveal secrets that no one wanted to face. The calm neighborhood was the perfect cover for something deeply sinister. A story of betrayal, cruelty, and horror that would haunt those left behind for years to come. As the days stretched on with no sign of Ruth Reynolds, the neighbors' worry turned into unease. Agnes Carter, who had first noticed the strange smell, grew more anxious. The sharp, sour odor seemed to seep through the cracks of the Reynolds house, drifting across the street and into the yards of nearby homes. It was unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced before. Not the smell of a simple kitchen accident or spoiled food. This was something more unsettling, something that made the skin crawl. People began talking in hushed tones, exchanging theories and fears. Some thought it might be a gas leak, while others whispered that something terrible had happened inside the house. Despite their concern, no one wanted to pry too deeply or confront David directly. He was known to be private, sometimes distant, and no one wanted to stir up trouble or make things worse. Still, the silence coming from the Reynolds home was deafening. Phone calls to David went unanswered. Text messages and emails from Ruth's relatives and friends bounced back without reply. Even the mail piled up, undelivered and forgotten on the porch. The once well-maintained garden started to wither, unattended and dry in the summer heat. It was clear that something was wrong, but no one knew what. Finally, the family contacted the police, urging them to perform a welfare check. Officers arrived quietly, knocking on the door which hung slightly ajar. When there was no response, they stepped inside, the air thick and heavy. The smell hit them first, a harsh, metallic stench that made their stomachs turn. As they moved deeper into the house, their flashlights cut through the rising steam, revealing the kitchen in a state of eerie stillness. The source of the steam was a large metal pot sitting on the stove, its contents unknown but still simmering. The floor was damp, with puddles of water spreading beneath the stove and cabinet edges. Then came the grim discovery. Ruth Reynolds' body was found collapsed in the kitchen, her head trapped inside the pot. The sight was so shocking and surreal that even the seasoned officers struggled to grasp the horror before them. The scene raised immediate questions. How long had she been like this? Why had David not called for help? And most disturbingly, why was her head inside a boiling pot? It was clear this was no accident. The house, once a home filled with quiet routines and soft conversations, had become a prison of suffering. Detective Laura Mitchell was assigned to the case. As she began piecing together the timeline, she noticed evidence of struggle and signs that Ruth had tried desperately to escape or call for help. Notes were found hidden in drawers, scribbled messages from Ruth begging for rescue. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person to a crime scene. David's disappearance deepened the mystery. His car was found abandoned miles away, suggesting he had fled the area. The neighbors who once thought he was just a private man now saw him in a terrifying new light. What had driven him to such violence, and what had he done to Ruth in the days, or perhaps years, before this terrible moment? The neighborhood was left shaken. The house that had once been a quiet part of their lives now held a dark secret that none of them could ignore. As the police began their search for David, the community waited anxiously, hoping for answers but fearing the worst. The strange smell was gone, but its memory lingered, a chilling reminder of the evil that had been boiling just beneath the surface. Detective Laura Mitchell began her investigation with a deep sense of urgency. From the moment she stepped inside the Reynolds home, she knew this case was more than just a tragic accident. The hidden notes Ruth had left behind spoke volumes, desperate pleas for help, written in shaky handwriting, revealing years of silent suffering. Each paper was a window into a life trapped by fear and control. It became clear that Ruth had endured more than anyone had suspected. As Laura dug into the family's history, she discovered a pattern of abuse. Neighbors who had once described David as quiet or private started sharing stories of tense moments and strange incidents. Some recalled overhearing harsh arguments, muffled cries, or seeing Ruth with bruises she tried to hide. None had suspected it would escalate to such horror. Financial records added another layer to the puzzle. Ruth's bank accounts showed repeated withdrawals and transfers, large sums disappearing without clear explanation. Laura suspected David had been stealing from his mother, draining her savings for his own use while blaming her for his problems. It was a cruel betrayal, taking advantage of the very person who had cared for him all her life. Friends of Ruth's family painted a heartbreaking picture. Ruth had tried reaching out for support but had been isolated, cut off from help by David's controlling behavior. She had feared the outside world and felt trapped in her own home. The house, which should have been a sanctuary, had become a prison where hope slowly faded. Laura's team found more clues hidden throughout the house. Old photographs showing Ruth's happier times, letters from distant relatives she could no longer contact, and a calendar marked with crossed-out days, as if Ruth was counting down the time until something would change. Each discovery deepened the detectives' resolve to bring justice. But the biggest shock came when they learned about David's mental state. Interviews with his former employers and acquaintances revealed a man increasingly troubled, prone to outbursts, and unable to keep steady jobs. Friends had noticed a growing bitterness, a dark cloud hanging over him. It was a warning sign that no one had taken seriously enough. Detective Mitchell began to understand the tragic chain of events, how David's anger and desperation had built up over the years until it exploded in the most violent way imaginable. The boiling pot in the kitchen was not a random act, but a cruel symbol of his rage. Ruth's head trapped inside the scalding water was meant to punish and control, a horrific expression of power twisted by hate. The community struggled to come to terms with the revelations. How could someone so close, a son and a caretaker, inflict such pain? Why had no one seen the signs sooner? The investigation exposed the uncomfortable truth about hidden abuse, isolation, and the silent suffering of victims behind closed doors. As Laura prepared to pursue the next phase of the case, the focus shifted to finding David. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but he remained elusive. The detective knew that capturing him was crucial not only for justice, but to prevent more tragedy. The story of Ruth Reynolds was far from over, and the dark secrets uncovered would haunt those involved for a long time. Through careful detective work, the cruel reality of Ruth and David's relationship came into full view. It was a story of pain, betrayal, and a desperate cry for freedom. A chilling reminder that evil often wears a familiar face, hiding in the shadows of everyday life. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing picture of David Reynolds' state of mind began to emerge. It wasn't just a moment of rage or a sudden loss of control. Evidence showed that David had been planning something dark and terrible for months. His anger toward his mother was deep and festering, fueled by years of resentment and frustration. Detective Laura Mitchell uncovered messages on David's phone and computer, angry texts to friends, and disturbing online searches related to pain and punishment. These digital footprints revealed a mind consumed by bitterness. He had researched ways to harm someone without leaving obvious marks, showing a cold, calculated approach rather than a snap decision. Inside the Reynolds home, the boiling pot was more than just a cruel weapon. It was a symbol of his twisted rage. David had deliberately chosen to use the stove, a place tied to nurturing and comfort, to commit his crime. The kitchen, where Ruth once baked pies and prepared meals, had become a chamber of torment. The act of trapping her head in a pot of boiling water was meant to dehumanize and destroy her spirit, to make her suffer in the most personal, painful way imaginable. Neighbors and friends were shocked when they learned about this detail. What had seemed like a quiet family secret was, in reality, a storm of hatred that had grown unchecked. David's growing isolation, loss of jobs, and failure to maintain relationships fed a toxic brew of anger directed at his mother, who had become the focus of all his pain. Interviews with people who knew David revealed a man who had been slipping further into darkness. He had once been friendly, if troubled, but over time, his behavior changed. Friends noticed he became more controlling, aggressive, and unpredictable. There was talk of jealousy and deep-seated resentment toward Ruth, who had tried to protect him despite her own struggles. Financial pressures added fuel to the fire. David's theft of his mother's savings not only stripped her of financial security, but also seemed to feed his sense of entitlement and power. The house that should have been a refuge was a battleground for control, and David's cruelty escalated as he felt more trapped by his failures and frustrations. Detective Mitchell pieced together the final days before the murder. Ruth had been desperate, hiding her pain in notes and silent cries for help. David's anger had reached a breaking point. The chilling scene in the kitchen was the horrifying climax of this toxic relationship. Despite all the evidence, David remained missing, adding to the fear and uncertainty. His disappearance was seen as an admission of guilt and a last attempt to escape responsibility. The community was left reeling, struggling to understand how such darkness had grown in their midst. The story of David Reynolds was not just about a crime of passion, but a calculated act of cruelty born from years of neglect, abuse, and growing hatred. It was a stark reminder that evil often festers quietly until it explodes, leaving devastation behind. For Detective Laura Mitchell, the case was a harsh lesson in the complexities of family violence and the hidden suffering that can go unnoticed. The boiling pot in the kitchen became a haunting symbol, a reminder that sometimes the worst horrors come from those who should protect us the most. The hunt for David continued, but the scars left by his actions would remain long after the case was closed. Weeks passed with no sign of David Reynolds. The man wanted for the brutal murder of his mother had seemingly vanished into thin air. Detective Laura Mitchell led an intense search, coordinating with law enforcement across state lines, following every lead and tip that came in. Despite the efforts, David remained elusive, slipping through the cracks like a ghost determined to escape justice. Eventually, David was found hiding in a rundown motel hundreds of miles away. His capture brought some relief, but opened a new chapter in the tragic story. At the courthouse, the full horror of what he had done was laid bare. Evidence was presented in heartbreaking detail. The years of abuse, the stolen savings, the cruel planning, and the shocking method of murder. The trial was a grim spectacle that gripped the community. People who once admired David struggled to reconcile the image of the polite neighbor with that of a cold, calculated killer. Ruth Reynolds, who had been a beloved figure in the neighborhood, was remembered through tearful testimonies from family and friends who wished they had seen the signs sooner. David's defense tried to argue insanity, painting him as a broken man overwhelmed by mental illness. But the overwhelming evidence showed a mind consumed by hate and control, someone who had chosen cruelty rather than seeking help or healing. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing was swift. David Reynolds was given life imprisonment without parole, ensuring he would never harm anyone again. But the community's healing was far from complete. The story of Ruth's death left a permanent scar, a painful reminder of how violence can hide behind closed doors, masked by silence and fear. Detective Laura Mitchell continued to speak about the case, hoping to raise awareness about abuse and encourage victims to seek help before tragedy strikes. She reminded everyone that often the warning signs are subtle: a bruise covered by clothing, a missed phone call, a neighbor's quiet concern. It is up to the community to listen and act. Neighbors organized memorials for Ruth, planting flowers and sharing stories to honor her life beyond the tragedy. They vowed to look out for one another more closely, determined not to let such darkness go unnoticed again. The Reynolds house was eventually sold, but the memory of what happened there lingered. It stood as a silent witness to the pain and betrayal. Inside, a symbol of the evil that can fester even in the most ordinary places. The case became a cautionary tale told in law enforcement circles and among social workers, reminding everyone of the importance of vigilance and compassion. Ruth Reynolds' story, though tragic, sparked conversations and changes that might save others from similar fates. In the end, the community learned a painful truth. Evil does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it lives next door, behind familiar faces and quiet smiles. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those we never see coming.